Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share encounters with black-eyed children. These stories include a man who came across a pair of strange-acting children in the road one night, a man who sees something freaky while walking to work in Philadelphia, a boy who answered the door to find two unfamiliar children that left his grandfather visibly shaken, an absolutely bizarre sighting of one of these beings in a department store you won't want to miss, and a girl in the UK whose nan had a weird visitor at the door late one night. But first, we start with a story from Texas where a young man got quite the scare in his backyard at a very late hour. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who encountered black-eyed children in the summer of 2009. His encounter takes place in Texas, where he grew up hearing about black-eyed children stories, tales, and legends due to encounters being so common in the area where he lived. He does not say where exactly he lives, just that he lives in the plains of Texas. When the original poster or OP was young, he never truly believed black-eyed children existed. He says he entertained the stories mainly as a joke or something to get a rise out of people. But everything changed when he had an encounter of his own back in 2009. It was a warm summer night in June and he was up late at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. This was normal as he enjoyed staying up late, especially during the summer because it was warm out even after sunset. He had gone to the store to grab a big fountain drink and returned home. As he was about to go inside through the back door, two children approached him. The sight of a boy and a girl startled him, being that he didn't expect to see anyone outside of his home, much less in the backyard, and so late at night. The boy asked if they could come inside, then said they were lost and needed to use his phone. This is when the OP saw their eyes and that both children had solid black eyes. He described them as looking like he was staring into pits. His heart sank in that moment. He couldn't believe he was actually seeing the fabled black-eyed children standing right there in front of him. Being that he had heard the legends his whole life, he was prepared for that moment, and there was no way he was going to allow them to enter his home. The OP acted quickly, bolting inside his house and turning to close and lock the door as fast as he could. He then ran upstairs and turned the lights on before looking out to see if the children were still there, but they were gone. This did not stop him from grabbing a weapon and searching the rest of his house, checking to make sure all of his doors and windows were closed and locked. He says it took him hours to get to sleep that night, and that the encounter with the black-eyed boy and girl will remain with him for the rest of his life. He ends his post by saying that these entities took the form of something that most people see as innocent, weak, and mild in order to fool unsuspecting victims so they can do unspeakable things or harm them. He says he's glad his instincts kicked in and he was able to get out of there alive to tell his story. The last thing I would expect in the middle of the night would be to encounter people in my backyard, but especially children by themselves. It's a good thing the OP was well versed in black-eyed children's stories and knew exactly what to do when he saw the boy and girl's eyes. I could imagine that seeing something standing there before you that you thought was nothing but myth and legend would have a pretty big impact on you. This seems to be the case here as the OP had trouble sleeping that night. And who can blame him? I know I'd have trouble sleeping if I encountered beings like these too. I'm just glad he didn't waste any time getting into his home and away from them, and there was no further incident. That brings up another thought and something I've noticed in these stories. That once you tell them no or close the door, these black-eyed children normally disappear and leave the people alone. Now I know there have been stories where they continue to knock or call out through the door, but usually they move on when rejected. What would you have done if you were trying to get into your back door and two children mysteriously appeared in your backyard? The next story comes from a poster who experienced something while driving home one night that shook him to his core. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he lives in the Deep South. The original poster was driving out to his grandfather's barn one night to retrieve his brother's wallet at about 9 p.m. While he was there grabbing the wallet for his brother, he had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. He says here that about a mile between his home and his grandfather's barn is a culvert, which is a tunnel or drain that runs under the road for water to move through. It's at this culvert in the road that there is a large hill with a curve you have to drive very slowly around to avoid having an accident, according to the OP. While he was driving back home, he came to the hill and eventually to the curve, where he slowed down to what he describes as a crawl to stay safe during this treacherous leg of his journey. As he was taking this curve, he saw two children standing in the road. The OP, self-described as a, quote, good-natured redneck, his words not mine, stopped to see if they needed help. Growing up, he had always heard about strange and weird things happening on this road, which includes ghost lights, a woman asking for a ride only to scream if you agree to give her one before she disappears, and more, but he says this was a new one. So pulling to a stop beside the children, he asked them if they needed help. One of the children, a boy, asked him for a ride, but the OP says the boy's voice was way too calm, and he didn't make eye contact. This is where he mentions he lives in the deep south and jokingly says the state bird is a mosquito, because he looked to the other child then and saw that they were covered in mosquitoes, but were not reacting to them at all, and not even swatting them away. Finally, he asked the boy why he was looking down, and that's when he looked up at the OP with eyes black as coal, according to him. He wasted no time stomping on the gas pedal and getting out of there, flying up the hill and barely making the curve. Both children stared at him as he sped off, kicking up gravel and dust in his car's wake. I've heard stories where weird things happen to people while driving at night, and I think most of us, if not all, would probably stop to try and help two children out that late in a remote area alone. But for them to be acting as weird as this, and then to look at him with eyes that are completely black, would cause anyone to stomp on the gas pedal. There is nothing natural about these entities, from their demeanors, the way they act and speak, to their black eyes. I always get a sense of evil when reading these stories and know these beings have ill intent for anyone they come across. That's why it's important to never let them into your home or your car. Nothing good ever comes from that. What would you have done if you were in the OP's shoes and came across two children standing in the road while driving at night? The next story is a little different in that the poster did not encounter black-eyed children, a man who had black eyes while working in Philadelphia. He does not say when his story takes place, just that he was college-aged at the time. One day he was on his way to work at a satellite store by himself, which was several blocks away from where he normally worked. He had gone by and picked up the keys to the store from his boss and went on his way. When he was 3 blocks away from the store where he would be working that day, he noticed a man walking toward him. It was when he saw this man that he says 1,000 alarm signals started going off in his head. The man was staring at the ground when the OP first saw him, but when he looked up, the OP was taken aback to see that the man had solid black eyes. He says that even though they had no detail whatsoever, they felt like they were burning a hole into his head as they stared at him. The sight of the man's eyes sent a chill through the OP, and he took off running the rest of the way to the store. He was on edge all day and even took a different route back to his regular store to drop the keys back off to his boss after work. He never saw the man again or anyone else like him. He noticed that the weirdest thing about his encounter was that the man looked entirely normal other than his pitch black eyes. He looked like a regular middle-class guy wearing a worn-out Levi jacket, jeans, and old leather shoes. Nothing else about the man stuck out to the OP, and he even says no one else around seemed to be paying him any mind. This is the first I've heard where someone encounters an adult with black eyes rather than children. But if these beings are able to take the form of whoever or whatever they want, I don't doubt that they would be able to take the form of an adult. I think they normally take the form of children because people would be more open to telling children yes, they can come inside, or yes, they'll give them a ride and allowing them to enter their car or their home, and by extension, their life. But I digress. I don't blame the OP for running the rest of the way to work and then taking an alternate route back to give the keys back to his boss. It had to be terrifying to look into the eyes of that man. What would you do if you were walking down the street and made eye contact with someone who had black eyes just like the man in this story? The next story comes from a poster who had a scary encounter with two children late one night when he was just 7 years old. His encounter took place in Spencerville, Indiana. Spencerville is a small township in northeast Indiana very close to the Ohio border. Located in DeKalb County, it has a population of 3,614. It was fall and the OP had just gotten inside at around 9 p.m. from stacking hay. He cleaned up and changed clothes before going to see if there were any leftovers for him to eat. This is when he heard a knock at the door and went to see who was there. What he found standing outside on the covered porch were two children. They both had eyes that were as black as night, according to the OP, and they both asked him if they could come inside for a second to use the phone. He thought it was strange he had never seen them before, being that he knew all of the children in the small town. He asked them to wait and left them standing on the porch to go get his grandfather. His grandfather went outside and the OP heard him talking but couldn't make out what he was saying. When he came back in, the OP says his face was as white as a ghost and he told his grandson to go to bed. The OP, being that he was hungry and wanted some food, started to object, but says his grandfather yelled at him like he never had before. He had never heard about black-eyed children until a year before he posted his story online. When he heard about them is when his encounter came back to him, sending chills down his body. The OP did the right thing going and getting his grandfather and not just letting these children into the house. He doesn't mention being afraid, which makes me think he might have been too young to get what was really going on during this encounter. But the grandfather definitely seemed to understand what he came face to face with, as he was visibly shaken by the incident. What do you think about this one? Does it make you not want to answer the door at night? The next story is one of the most bizarre tales I've heard while researching black-eyed children. It comes from a poster who was working in a department store when he witnessed a very strange scene that quickly turned into a very scary one for him. This one involves another seeming adult with black eyes, but this is where it gets bizarre. The black-eyed girl in question was dressed and acting like she was a child. The OP's story begins with him at work in a department store where he was a warehouse person and stocker. On this particular night, he was on a ladder stocking shelves when he saw the strange scene below him. There was a young woman who looked to be in her 20s, but she was dressed like a little girl. The OP says she had pigtails and wore a pink dress, with the bottom of the dress being lacy and resembling a tutu. She was leading an old woman around the store, begging for candy and toys just like a child would behave. The OP thought this was odd as he stopped what he was doing and watched them from about 10 feet above. He noticed that the old woman was not responding to the young woman at all and even looked to be in a daze as the girl threw things into the shopping cart while laughing. This is when things take a turn from strange to downright scary, as the girl turned and looked up at the OP, making eye contact with him. He says he has never been more afraid in his entire life as he looked into her eyes, which were completely black. The girl snarled at him before laughing, and this sent a jolt of terror running through the OP. He says he came down off that ladder faster than he thought possible and went straight to the warehouse to tell his co-workers what he had just witnessed. His co-workers, of course, laughed at him and went out into the store to see if they could find the old woman and the girl for themselves, but they didn't see them anywhere. The cashiers later told the OP they saw the old woman buying the candy and toys, but the girl was not with her and nowhere to be seen. One thing that I thought when reading this story, and something I expected, was for the staff to look at or at least request to see the camera footage if there were cameras in the store, which I'm guessing there was, being that they are everywhere these days. I'd be interested to see if the girl showed up on camera, being that the cashiers remember seeing the old woman but never saw her. This again points to the fact that these beings are paranormal in nature. I mean, it could also be that the girl just wasn't with the old woman at the checkout, but for her to look up at the OP with eyes that are black, and with the old woman being in a daze, makes me think something else was going on here, something more sinister. What do you think about this one? Do you think the OP was the only one who could see the girl? And do you think that this being had the old woman in some kind of trance-like state? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster in the UK, who also thought of black-eyed children as an urban legend until she remembered an instance where she was a witness to an encounter as a child. She posted her story online in hopes that others would be able to share their thoughts, comments, or explanations about what happened. The encounter took place while the OP and her brothers were staying at their nan's house. One night, there came a knock at the door at about 12:30 a.m. She describes the knocking as rapid and loud enough to wake up everyone in the house. This could also be partially attributed to the dog going crazy when the knocking happened. The OP's nan eventually made it to the door and answered. She and her brothers could hear her talking to someone for a while before they heard her close the door. They went downstairs to see that their nan was visibly shaking. When asked, she told the children that a young boy under the age of 16 was at the door wearing a black trench coat. When she opened the door, he put his hand up in front of the dog's face, and the dog stopped barking. This was odd because the dog was blind and only responded to verbal cues. The boy then asked several times if he could come inside, but would not give her a reason why. He also outright refused to answer questions about where his parents were at the time. The OP's nan refused to let him in, but when she went to close the door, she found it a struggle to do so. She wanted to close the door, but had to physically fight to actually complete the action. After the incident was over, she looked outside but did not see the strange boy anywhere. The nan in this story does not mention if the boy had black eyes or not, but everything else about this screams black-eyed children. From the knocking on the door at a late hour to being dressed strangely and asking to enter the home. Something else that caught my attention about this story was how the being quieted the blind dog with a physical cue rather than a verbal one. I've never doubted that these beings are supernatural and/or paranormal, but this just confirms that for me. That and the effect he had on the nan when she was trying to close the door. These beings give off a certain aura when encountering someone. This usually fills the person with dread, fear, and other strong emotions. But this is the first I've heard where the person had to physically fight to close the door. Now, I have heard stories where the children try to force their way in, but this is different. Again, it only points to these beings, whatever they really are, demons most likely in my opinion, being supernatural. What would you do if you answered the door to see one of these beings standing there asking to come inside? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.